In the dim hush of a medieval dawn, before the church bells stirred the town awake, life began not with alarm clocks or the hum of traffic, but with the faint crackle of a hearth fire and the smell of damp straw. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of rain-soaked timber and the faint sweetness of baking bread from some distant kitchen. In this quiet world, every sound mattered: the creak of a wooden cart, the clang of an iron pot, the first crowing of a rooster. Life was slow, heavy, and deliberate, and within this slow rhythm existed a tapestry of jobs that, to our modern eyes, seem impossibly strange, absurd even. But back then, every role had a reason. Every strange duty made sense in a world that survived on fragile balance. The medieval city was alive in its own way. Streets were narrow and slick with mud. Walls leaned inward as if whispering secrets. There were no streetlights, no running water, no concept of convenience. So when the baker stirred his dough before sunrise, someone had to walk the streets with a long pole topped with a smoldering ember to light his way. This man was called the link boy. It sounds trivial, perhaps even laughable, but without him, night itself was a danger. Darkness in the Middle Ages was not romantic or peaceful. It was alive with thieves, rats, and disease. The link boy guided nobles through the pitch black, earning a few copper coins for every safe journey. He was, in a way, the medieval streetlight. Imagine him, barefoot, a torn cloak around his shoulders, holding his torch high as rain patters down. The flame flickers and dances, illuminating his face for a moment before plunging him back into shadow. Behind him, a wealthy merchant hurries along, clutching his purse, whispering thanks under his breath as they pass through the foul stench of an alleyway. Without the link boy, the merchant might lose his way, or his life. In a city with no lamps and no patrols, this small boy was a beacon. But as dawn rose, other trades woke too. There was the gong farmer, the man responsible for cleaning out what no one wanted to think about. Every town had cesspits, deep holes where waste collected. The gong farmer would climb down into those pits at night, armed with nothing more than a shovel and a prayer. The smell was unbearable. It was said their clothes had to be buried after each week's work, for no washing could cleanse them. People crossed the street to avoid them in daylight. Yet without them, the city would drown in filth, disease would sweep through, and entire populations could fall to plague. It was one of the lowest professions imaginable, and one of the most vital. When he worked, the moon was his only witness. The silence of night was broken by the slosh of waste and the scrape of his shovel. His reward was money that others considered dirty, but it was enough to live on. Sometimes he'd even find treasure, rings, coins, or jewels dropped accidentally into the latrine. Those small discoveries were whispered blessings, reminders that even in filth, fortune could glimmer. Far above him, in the towers of castles and manors, another job unfolded, the gong scourer or scullion, tasked with scrubbing pots and chamber pots alike. Their hands were raw, skin peeling from ash and soap. In the kitchens, the scullions worked in suffocating heat, often the youngest servants, washing endlessly while feasts raged above them. The laughter of nobles echoed faintly through the stone floors. They were invisible, yet essential. And still higher, in the same castles, lived the falconers. They trained birds of prey for nobles who hunted not out of hunger, but out of pride. The falconer's craft was a mixture of science and intuition. He knew the language of wings, the weight of air beneath a kestrel's feather, the precise whistle that summoned an eagle from the sky. These men were respected, even envied. Their birds were symbols of nobility, their work an art form. To see a falcon spiral through a pale morning sky was to witness mastery, the harmony between man and nature. Yet for every noble art, there was an odd necessity. One such trade was that of the sin-eater. This man would be called upon when someone died, particularly the poor who could not afford a priest. The sin-eater's role was both horrifying and holy. He would sit by the body, a loaf of bread placed upon the dead person's chest. He would eat the bread and drink ale, symbolically consuming the sins of the departed. To others, he was cursed. People avoided his gaze, whispering that his soul was tainted by hundreds of deaths. But in truth, He was a vessel of mercy, a man who took upon himself the spiritual burden of others so they could rest in peace. In a world where heaven and hell were absolute truths, the sin-eater was a quiet hero. Down in the villages, another peculiar figure walked from house to house, the knocker-up. Long before alarm clocks, this person's job was to wake people for work by tapping on their windows with a long stick. In the pre-dawn mist, he'd move from one door to another, whispering names, rapping gently against glass panes. The poor relied on him, for missing a day's labor could mean losing food for the week. The knocker-up was the thin thread between order and chaos in a society that depended on punctuality but had no clocks to trust. There were also the leech, collectors. They waded through swamps and rivers, letting the blood-sucking creatures cling to their legs. Each leech was prized for medical use, believed to balance the body's humors. The collectors' legs were often scarred, their blood drained, yet their work fueled medieval medicine. In their pain, others found healing. The irony was almost poetic. They bled so that others could live. In the dusty roads outside the cities, herb women and cunning men practiced folk medicine. They gathered plants, ground them with stones, whispered charms over the sick. Some called them healers, others witches, but their knowledge was often more effective than that of a physician. In villages where doctors were rare and expensive, these quiet figures kept communities alive. A sprig of rosemary for fever, a poultice of moss for wounds, a prayer for strength. The line between science and superstition was blurred, and they walked it gracefully. As the day warmed, the blacksmith's hammer began to ring through the air, sharp, steady, rhythmic. Sparks danced in the dim forge. He was not a strange worker, perhaps, but his world was filled with odd rituals. Never forging on certain days, never crossing iron tools, whispering charms over the steel to keep it strong. The forge was his church, his hammer, his hymn. Even stranger were the nailmen who collected broken iron nails from old shoes and doors, melting them to reuse the metal. Nothing was wasted in medieval times. To survive, everything had to be repurposed. As afternoon shadows stretched across the cobblestones, another strange figure emerged, the rat catcher, a wiry man with a sack, a whistle, and a dozen cages. The cities teemed with vermin, and plague was a constant threat. The rat catcher's skill was both practical and perilous. He'd set traps, lure rodents, and sometimes use trained ferrets to flush them out. The rats were burned or sold for their tails, which some towns paid for as proof of extermination. His work was filthy, dangerous, but absolutely essential. Without him, pestilence would spread like wildfire. And so, the tapestry of strange medieval jobs unfolds. Link boys lighting the dark, gong farmers purging filth, sin-eaters consuming sorrow, and rat-catchers saving cities from plague. Each role, no matter how bizarre, was born from necessity. The medieval world was harsh, unforgiving. Every strange rule and profession grew out of a desperate need. To survive, to maintain balance, to keep life moving in an age where death was never far away. As twilight descended again, the link boy would light his torch once more. The faint glow spread over cobblestones slick with evening dew. Somewhere, a gong farmer finished his shift, wiping sweat and filth from his brow. A sin-eater sat alone in the dark, tasting bread in silence. And in the stillness of that forgotten world, the rhythm of human survival pulsed on, a reminder that even the strangest jobs once held the weight of reason, duty, and a strange kind of dignity. The wind whispered through the narrow alleys, carrying the echoes of their footsteps into the night. The medieval town exhaled. It would sleep now, under the watchful flicker of a single trembling flame. Night folds gently over the old kingdom again. The torches along the castle walls sputter in the wind, each one burning like a fragile promise against the deep, endless dark. Inside the thick stone halls, life never truly sleeps. It merely softens. Servants move in silence, their footsteps muffled by straw on the floors. A faint metallic clang echoes from somewhere deep below, the armory perhaps, or the prison. And among these hushed corridors walked men and women with tasks that to modern minds might seem grotesque, unnecessary, or absurd, yet without whom the entire structure of medieval society might have collapsed. One such man was the executioner, a figure both feared and needed. His hood was not always black. Sometimes it was bare flesh. His face known, his name whispered only in warnings. The executioner lived at the edge of towns, away from others. He was paid in coin, meat, and ale, but never respect. Children would throw stones at his door. Yet when the church bell tolled for justice, he was the one everyone waited for. His blade, sharpened and cold, was the final voice of the law. To us, he seems a symbol of cruelty, but in the medieval mind, the executioner was a servant of divine balance. His duty kept chaos from spreading. Without him, vengeance would rule the streets. When he raised his sword, the crowd fell silent, not out of joy, but out of awe, the trembling recognition that death was never far away. In a strange way, he was both villain and guardian, walking the thin line between sin and salvation. And not far from him, another figure performed a very different kind of sacred duty, the food taster. Before every royal feast, before the silver trays were carried into the hall, someone had to take the first bite. Poison was a quiet weapon in those days, and kings lived in constant fear of betrayal. The taster's job was to eat, slowly, carefully, every dish meant for the ruler. He watched for the tremor of numbness, the burn of bitterness, the ache behind the eyes that meant death was coming. If he survived, the king could dine. Imagine that strange ritual. The long table, candles flickering, the taster standing with measured calm, chewing what could be his last meal. He bowed slightly, eyes down, as nobles laughed and talked, unaware that every swallow he took was an act of courage. To serve meant to risk everything, and yet it was an honor few could refuse. Far from the glitter of the castle, in quiet alleys and plague-ridden villages, there were others whose work carried different horrors. The leper caretaker, for instance. In an age where disease was both mystery and curse, lepers were cast out, banished beyond the walls. Their skin bore marks no one understood, and so they were feared like walking omens. But the caretakers, often monks or outcasts themselves, stayed beside them. They brought food, washed their wounds, prayed with them in chapels made of rough wood. They did not wear masks or gloves. Faith was their only protection. In their quiet service lay a kind of bravery that went unspoken, unseen. The world outside those colonies trembled with other dangers. The plague doctor became an emblem of death itself, the long-beaked mask filled with herbs, the dark robe sealing the body against unseen contagion. His job was not to heal, but to witness, to record, to separate the living from the dying. He walked through streets where silence was broken only by the wails of the sick and the toll of funeral bells. People hid at the sight of him, for his presence meant death had come close. Yet his strange costume and rituals had purpose. The herbs in his mask filtered the foul air. His stick kept distance from patients. In his eerie attire, practicality and superstition merged. And then there were the royal fools, perhaps the strangest professionals of all. Dressed in bright colors, jingling bells at their feet, they danced, mocked, and told truths that no one else dared to say. Beneath the laughter, they were philosophers disguised as clowns. A fool could criticize a king when even nobles could not. His humor was armor, his jest a blade. He survived by turning wisdom into wit. Many were learned men, skilled in song, memory, and mimicry. Their absurdity had purpose, to ease tension, to reveal truth through laughter. Somewhere deeper in the castle, another strange scent filled the air, the smoky sweetness of melting wax. Here worked the candlemaker, a humble yet vital trade. Before electricity, light was a luxury. Candles were molded from tallow, a thick, greasy fat that filled workshops with an unbearable stench. Beeswax was rare and reserved for the church. The candlemaker's hands were always oily, his clothes stained with smoke. Yet without him, nights would be endless, prayers unlit, and stories untold. By contrast, the town crier worked in daylight, yet his voice carried through every shadowed street. Before newspapers, before literacy spread, he was the living messenger. Standing in the square, bell in hand, he shouted news, proclamations, births, deaths, taxes, and war. His words stitched the community together. Everyone knew his cry. It was the heartbeat of the town's rhythm. Even when rumors of plague or famine swept through, it was the crier who broke the silence first, transforming fear into knowledge. And among the lower ranks of order was the beadle, a kind of medieval enforcer, part watchman, part gossip, part moral guardian. He patrolled churchyards, chased away beggars, ensured people came to Mass. He carried a staff as a symbol of authority, but most of his power lay in presence. The beadle was the invisible thread between church and people, between rules and obedience. In another corner of the medieval world, tucked away in shadowy rooms filled with smoke and strange glass bottles, the alchemist's apprentice toiled endlessly. The alchemist sought to turn base metals into gold, to discover the elixir of eternal life. His apprentice swept floors, stoked fires, mixed powders whose names sounded like spells. To modern science, it was foolishness, but through these strange rituals came the birth of chemistry itself. What they called magic was, in truth, curiosity, the same spark that would one day light laboratories across the world. Outside, in the villages beyond the castle's shadow, there were still other strange callings. The bone gatherers, who collected remains from old graves to make room for new burials. The corpse watchmen, who sat through the night to ensure the dead truly were dead. The bell ringers, who marked every hour of life and death alike. Each of these jobs, no matter how grim, existed to keep the fragile fabric of life from unraveling. The medieval world was not ignorant, it was ingenious within its limits. Every strange job arose from a simple truth. Survival required order, and order required roles that no one wanted, yet everyone depended upon. These people, executioners, leech collectors, sin-eaters, fools, and doctors, lived in the thin light between reason and fear. As the night deepened, the castle dimmed to a soft glow. The candlemaker's flame flickered. The fool's laughter faded into memory. Somewhere, the town crier slept with his bell beside him, ready for dawn. And far out in the misty fields, a leper caretaker whispered a final prayer over the dying. The stars looked down, indifferent yet eternal. The medieval world turned slowly beneath them, its strange professions forgotten, but not meaningless. Each one was a small thread in the vast tapestry of human endurance. And so, the night sighs once more. The torches fade, the moon drifts high, and the world returns to silence. In that silence lies the echo of every hand that worked, every life that labored unseen. Strange, yes, but never without purpose. Morning comes slowly to the countryside. Mist coils around the thatched roofs, the sun still hidden behind a pale gray veil. Roosters crow, dogs stir, and the faint clatter of wooden wheels begins somewhere far down a muddy road. In this soft light, the rhythm of medieval life resumes, not in grandeur or wealth, but in quiet endurance. Here, away from the noise of cities and castles, the strangest jobs were often born not out of law or trade, but out of need. The first of these wandering figures to appear is the tooth puller, part barber, part surgeon, part entertainer. He travels from village to village with a small wooden cart, filled with crude metal tools, a stool, and sometimes a drum or flute to attract attention. His banner flutters in the breeze, painted with a bright red tooth. Crowds gather in the square, murmuring. The tooth puller grins, revealing his own crooked smile. He knows the crowd craves a show as much as a cure. A brave soul steps forward, grimacing in pain. There is no anesthetic, no mercy of modern medicine, only a swig of ale and the sharp tug of iron. A scream pierces the morning air. The crowd cheers. A tooth, glistening and red, is held up triumphantly. The pain is gone and the people applaud. The tooth puller bows, collects his coins, and moves on to the next town. Brutal, yes, but in a world without dentists, his craft was survival. Nearby, another traveler passes through, the tinker, or the mender of things. His trade is quieter, humbler. He fixes broken pots, sharpens knives, repairs buckles. His life is a constant road, his pack heavy with tools and stories. The tinker's arrival was a small celebration in any village, for he could restore what others would throw away. Nothing was disposable in this world. Everything could be mended. In his work, lay a quiet wisdom that life, like metal, could be reshaped with patience and fire. Along the edges of forests and moors, other figures lingered, the herb gatherers and charm women. Their baskets overflowed with leaves, roots, and flowers, feverfew, valerian, wormwood, lavender. They knew which herb soothed a fever, which one drew out poison, which whispered the promise of sleep. Their knowledge was ancient, older than the churches that now scorned them. To some they were healers, to others witches. They spoke softly, moved carefully, and lived on the border between the natural and the forbidden. At night, their homes glowed faintly with candlelight as they ground herbs and muttered prayers, both pagan and Christian. The world feared them, but when a child fell ill or a mother bled too long after childbirth, people came knocking in the dark, begging for help. And they always came. Their strange profession carried both reverence and danger. For one accusation of witchcraft could turn healer into heretic overnight. Meanwhile, in monasteries and abbeys, other unusual professions thrived behind cloistered walls. The illuminator, for example, sat bent over parchment, painting golden halos around saints, blue skies around angels, and crimson robes for Christ. His hands never saw sunlight. His world was pigment and prayer. The paints he used were made from crushed minerals, lapis lazuli, malachite, cinnabar, each worth more than gold. The illuminator's work was devotion given form, a labor of faith. Though he may never have spoken a word to the outside world, his colors whispered across centuries, glowing still in the margins of ancient books. And in those same monasteries lived the bell ringer, whose life followed the toll of time itself. Before clocks, it was the bell that ruled every day. It marked dawn prayers, midday meals, vespers, funerals. Rain or snow, the bell ringer climbed the narrow spiral stairs, pulling ropes heavier than his own body, filling the valley with sound. He knew the world by echoes, the echo of metal through stone, of faith through air. Beyond the monastery walls, roads stretched endlessly toward marketplaces. There the peddler moved like a living thread, connecting distant villages. His cart rattled with ribbons, combs, trinkets, herbs, and sometimes whispers of news. He was both merchant and messenger, a voice from elsewhere in a world where elsewhere was a mystery. Children followed his cart, eyes wide with wonder. To them, he was a traveler from another realm. Among the strangest, yet most practical of medieval wanderers was the rat piper, a man who lured rats from granaries using reed flutes and whistles. His tunes were eerie, high-pitched, dancing through alleys like spells. He was part musician, part pest controller, and entirely necessary. The legend of the Pied Piper may have been born from men like him, half magician, half laborer, working in an age where rats meant death. As evening fell, the countryside dimmed into quiet again. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, the faint smell of stew drifting through open shutters. Yet beneath this peace, danger still pulsed. Wolves prowled the forests, bandits roamed the roads, and illness hid in every cough. The people who kept this fragile world together were not knights or kings. They were these nameless workers, these wanderers, whose crafts bordered on superstition and salvation alike. In the darker corners of towns, another curious figure took his nightly walk, the night soil man, cousin to the gong farmer. He emptied chamber pots, carried waste outside the walls, and sprinkled ash to keep the stench at bay. The townsfolk pretended he didn't exist by day, but they relied on him. His route was the unseen artery that kept the heart of the city clean. And though he stank of rot, he was a quiet guardian against plague. Somewhere, under the soft glow of moonlight, the watchman began his rounds. With a staff and lantern, he walked the empty streets, murmuring the hour, 2 o'clock, and all is well. His voice echoed off the stone. He checked the locks, the gates, the shadows. In a sense, he was the town's heartbeat in the dark hours. His calm announcements reminded the sleepless that life continued, that someone was awake, watching over them. In every layer of medieval life, there was purpose hidden within absurdity. The dog whipper in church, who kept animals quiet during sermons. The ale taster, who ensured the town's beer was safe to drink, the woodward, who guarded forests from thieves, even the water carrier, trudging from well to home, his shoulders bowed beneath the weight of wooden buckets. All of them were invisible pillars of survival. To live then was to serve, and to serve meant to belong to the land, to the faith, to the fragile circle of necessity. People did not choose their work. Work chose them. It was inherited, passed down like an heirloom, or stumbled upon through desperation. Each strange profession was a solution, born from the endless question, how can we keep going? As the night deepens once more, mist returns to the fields. The tooth puller sleeps in a barn, his tools wrapped in cloth beside him. The herb woman sits at her door, listening to owls in the distance. The bell ringer rests beneath the tower, his hands still trembling from the last toll. And the peddler, somewhere on the road, gazes up at the stars, each one a tiny spark of hope against the blackness. In their dreams, they are not poor or strange or forgotten. They are threads of meaning woven through time. The modern world will forget their names, but not their purpose. For every comfort we have now, every ease is built upon their labor, their pain, their invention, their endurance. The fire dies low. The wind sighs through the trees. Somewhere the faint jingle of a peddler's cart fades into silence. The medieval world exhales once again, sinking into the stillness of sleep. And as you listen, you can almost hear it, the creak of leather harnesses, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the soft song of a night watchman whispering into the dark, remnants of a world long gone, yet never entirely lost. Inside the heart of every medieval kingdom, beyond the muddy villages and smoky taverns, rose the fortress, the seat of power, fear, and strange duty. To live within those high stone walls was to breathe a different kind of air, scented with wax, sweat, and secrets. The echo of footsteps on marble floors told stories older than memory. Candles burned low in iron sconces, flickering like fragile hearts. And in that half-light, the strangest professions found their place, not among peasants or beggars this time, but among lords and kings. The castle was a living machine, each corridor humming with quiet labor. At dawn, before the royal family stirred, servants swept ashes from the great hearth, replaced the rushes on the floor, and polished goblets until they shone like morning dew. Among these invisible workers moved the groom of the stool, a man whose duty was both intimate and unimaginable to modern sensibility. His role was to assist the king with his most private bodily needs. It sounds absurd, grotesque even, but in truth, it was one of the most trusted positions in the realm. The groom of the stool controlled access to the monarch, managed secret correspondence, and handled financial documents. His intimacy with the king gave him political power no noble dared question. To attend to such an undignified act, yet hold such influence, was a contradiction that only the medieval world could produce. As the morning bell rang across the courtyard, the kitchen came alive. Fires roared, knives chopped, and voices shouted over boiling pots. Within that chaos worked the royal taster, cautious and deliberate. We met his kind before, but here within the castle, his task took on ritual precision. Each dish was tested, tasted, and approved before it could grace the king's table. The taste of fear, as much as flavor, lingered on his tongue. He was joined by the cupbearer, another position of quiet danger. The cupbearer stood beside the throne, holding the golden goblet with both hands. He drank before the king did, eyes always on the monarch's face, searching for a flicker of doubt. His loyalty was measured not in years of service, but in sips of poisoned wine survived. Trust was the kingdom's most fragile currency, and he carried it in every trembling gesture. Not far away, in the royal chambers, another curious figure worked in secrecy, the royal bedmaker. His duty was not simply to smooth the sheets, but to ensure that no harm could reach the monarch while he slept. Hidden blades, curses, or insects could be slipped into bedding by an enemy's hand. Every night, the bedmaker inspected every inch of fabric, whispering prayers against treachery. Sleep was never safe for kings. Outside those chambers, The royal messenger waited with sealed letters pressed to his chest. His job was speed and silence. Roads were dangerous. Forests hid thieves, and wars reshaped borders overnight. But he rode regardless, carrying secrets that could change the fate of nations. Some messages bore treaties, others death sentences. A single misplaced parchment could mean war. His was a lonely profession, one of endurance and unspoken duty. And then there were the spies, though they were never called that. Courtiers, servants, even jesters. Anyone could serve as the king's eyes. They listened, remembered, and reported. The royal court was a chessboard of whispers. Every laugh could hide a lie, every compliment a threat. In such a world, information was worth more than gold. Some spies were rewarded richly, others disappeared. At the edge of all this splendor moved the keeper of the wardrobe, whose job sounds simple, but was anything but. He managed not only the king's garments, but the entire treasury of textiles, jewels, and regalia. Every button, every thread, every fur lining was counted. Clothing was power, and in a world without portraits for the common man, appearance was politics. The keeper's records were meticulous, each robe catalogued, each crown weighed. Deeper still in the castle's belly, where the air smelled of iron and damp stone, worked the armorer. Sparks flew from his forge as he hammered steel into shape. Every link of chainmail, every plate of armor was made by his hands. He murmured charms to strengthen the metal, prayers whispered over fire. His craft was half science, half superstition. He believed the spirit of the forge itself lived in the bellow's breath. The herald walked above ground, dressed in color and pride. His duty was to announce noble births, battles won, deaths mourned. He spoke for kings in moments of ceremony and war alike. The sound of his trumpet marked the passage of time in the kingdom's history. Yet when the crowds dispersed, he returned to silence, polishing the very brass that carried his voice. And then there was the royal astrologer, gazing from his tower window into the turning heavens. To him, the stars were more than decoration. They were messages from the divine. He charted omens, predicted storms, read the future in planetary alignments. Kings listened. Empires moved by his counsel. His instruments, astrolabes, armillary spheres, candlelit charts, were relics of both science and mysticism. Though his words often mingled truth with poetry, they guided decisions that shaped lives far beyond his lonely tower. Not far from him worked the court alchemist, a man shrouded in mystery and the smell of sulfur. He mixed powders, burned metals, and whispered incantations under his breath. His laboratory was cluttered with strange glass flasks, bubbling liquids, and charred scrolls. He sought to turn lead into gold, but what he really searched for was understanding, the hidden pattern of the universe. Though most mocked him, kings kept him close, for every ruler dreamed of eternal wealth and life. Among the courtiers, one job stood apart, the royal fool or jester. Brightly dressed, his laughter filled the echoing halls. To the untrained eye, he was mere amusement, a juggler, a singer, a clown. But behind his antics lay sharp wit and courage. He could say what others could not. Wrapped in laughter, truth could pass unpunished. A clever fool could save his head with a joke. A foolish noble could lose his with a word. The jester's bells jingled like irony itself, ringing through the centuries. And in the shadows of all this pomp stood the ladies-in-waiting, attendants to queens and princesses. They lived lives of quiet sacrifice, always present, never central. They dressed the queen, comforted her in sorrow, bore her secrets. Some became confidants, others pawns in courtly schemes. Their smiles hid exhaustion. Their grace concealed fear, but in their devotion lay the strength that kept the monarchy human. The royal physician, too, walked a narrow path between science and superstition. He carried pouches of herbs, vials of colored liquid, and a mind full of prayers. He read the pulse, examined urine, and bled patients according to celestial charts. His tools were crude, but his purpose noble. He stood beside death daily, often powerless, yet never without faith. When a king recovered, he was praised. When one died, he was blamed. Still, he stayed. Far below, the castle rat-catcher worked in dank tunnels beneath the kitchens, setting traps and burning nests. The smell of rot filled the air, but his labor kept the palace clean. Like the gong farmer of the towns, he existed unseen, yet his absence would mean ruin. As dusk fell, the castle shifted once more. Candles were lit, guards changed, and the faint notes of a lute drifted from the great hall. The minstrel sang of battles and saints, his voice rising like smoke. Music was the kingdom's memory, carried by those who owned nothing but song. In those golden halls, everything seemed eternal, but behind every glimmer was someone's toil. The royal splendor was woven from the invisible labor of countless hands, the seamstress stitching in the dark, the servant polishing armor until dawn, the boy holding the torch through endless banquets. And when night came at last, and the castle's fires dimmed, the king slept surrounded by silence, the soft shuffling of guards, the sigh of the bedmaker, the whisper of a fool muttering a final joke to himself. Power, it seemed, was not only built by those who ruled, but by those who served. Every strange profession, from astrologer to cupbearer, existed to keep the illusion of divinity intact, to hold chaos outside the gates. The stars shone faintly above the towers. In his study, the royal astrologer traced their paths one last time before sleep. Down below, the groom of the stool extinguished the final candle. The castle inhaled and exhaled, like a great living beast settling for the night. And somewhere in that darkness, the faint jingle of the fool's bells echoed one last time, half laughter, half lament. The medieval court, with all its glitter and grime, drifted into slumber. Beyond the castle walls, where banners no longer fluttered and the echoes of noble laughter faded into the mist, stretched the true heart of the medieval world. It was not made of marble or gold, but of mud, sweat, and smoke. The villages that lay scattered across the fields were humble, yet alive with the quiet rhythm of necessity. And here, too, strange professions thrived, jobs born not from luxury, but from survival. The dawn began with sound. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer broke the night's silence, ringing across the valley like a heartbeat. In the faint light, the village smith bent over his forge, his face lit by fire. Sparks danced across his arms like tiny stars. He shaped not only iron, but the daily life of the entire settlement. His hands built the world, horseshoes for the plow, nails for the door, hinges for the chapel gate. Without him, the rhythm of the village would falter. But his work was more than craft. It was belief. Medieval people thought that iron held a spirit of protection, that hammering metal could drive away demons. The smith was part craftsman, part sorcerer. Children watched from a safe distance, eyes wide with awe, as he worked spells of smoke and steel. Not far away, by the edge of the forest, lived the charcoal burner, a man wrapped in soot, his face like a shadow. His hut was made of stacked logs, half buried in the earth, always whispering with smoke. For days he tended his smoldering piles of wood, turning timber into the coal that fed the smith's fire. Few spoke to him. He lived between worlds, half in the village, half in the wilderness. Yet without his blackened hands, no metal would sing in the forge, no bread would bake in the oven. As the sun climbed higher, the dusty road filled with movement. Merchants, pilgrims, and beggars shared the same path, their destinies woven together by trade and faith. Among them walked the peddler, his pack heavy with small treasures, pins, combs, ribbons, candles, trinkets carved from bone. He was a traveling world in himself, carrying gossip from one town to another. His voice called through the streets like a melody. Ribbons from the city, knives from the coast, stories from the road. People gathered around him, not only to buy, but to listen. In a world without newspapers, the peddler was both merchant and messenger. He brought news of distant wars, of kings' deaths, of miracles and plagues. His tales blurred the line between truth and invention, but no one cared. In his words, the world felt vast and alive. Further down the road, in the dust and sunlight, knelt a figure with hands outstretched, a pilgrim, his cloak faded from years of journeying. His badge glinted faintly, showing the scallop shell of Santiago or the cross of Jerusalem. Pilgrimage was both punishment and purification. Some went to seek forgiveness, others out of gratitude, and some simply to escape the weight of ordinary life. Along the way, they met innkeepers, relic sellers, thieves, and saints in disguise. The roads themselves were rivers of humanity, flowing endlessly between shrines and cathedrals. Each step was a prayer, each blister an offering. Along these roads thrived entire professions. Guide men, who led travelers through dangerous forests. Relic merchants, who sold fragments of bone or cloth claiming divine power. And pardoners, who promised salvation in exchange for coin. The pardoner's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. He carried a leather satchel filled with holy items, a feather from an angel's wing, a tear of the Virgin Mary, a splinter from the true cross. Most of it was forgery, but belief was stronger than truth. Villagers knelt before him, whispering confessions. For a few coins, they could buy forgiveness, cheap grace for heavy souls. In every marketplace, life buzzed like a hive. The fishmonger's table gleamed with scales and salt. The butcher's block dripped with the proof of his craft. The miller, covered in flour dust, shouted from his watermill by the stream, his wheel turning endlessly with the current. And above them all, the town crier stood in the square, ringing his bell, his voice booming, "Hear ye, hear ye!" The town crier was the living voice of authority. When decrees were issued or taxes changed, he spoke them aloud to the crowd. For those who could not read, and that meant most, the bell and the voice were law itself. He stood halfway between power and people, both respected and resented. Among the most vital yet thankless professions was the gravedigger. With a shovel and lantern, he kept vigil over death. His work never stopped, especially in times of plague. When bells tolled from the church tower, he knew what awaited him, a new mound of earth to turn, another name to forget. Yet his hands performed a sacred task, to give the dead their place, to keep the living safe from decay. In the same churchyard worked the bell ringer, pulling the ropes with steady rhythm. The bells marked every passage of life, birth, marriage, death, and every prayer between. Their tolling carried across valleys, telling time not by the sun, but by faith. And in the cool shadow of the church sat another curious figure, the scribe. Surrounded by parchment, ink, and silence, he copied texts by hand, letter by letter. Each page was a slow miracle. The smell of vellum and candle smoke filled the air as he bent over his desk, tracing words that would outlive kings. For him, writing was prayer, every stroke a devotion. Without such quiet labor, history itself would vanish. By noon, the market began to smell of sweat and roasting meat. Hawkers called, children laughed, dogs fought under carts. At the corner stood the barber surgeon, his red and white pole spinning lazily in the wind. He shaved beards, pulled teeth, and, if needed, performed surgery with the same razor. His basin glinted with both soap and blood. To him, medicine was a craft of courage more than knowledge. His neighbor, the apothecary, worked in a world of powders and jars. Shelves lined with dried herbs, sage, wormwood, foxglove, gleamed in the dim light. He ground them slowly, muttering recipes learned from centuries past. In a world without antibiotics, his shop was both hope and illusion. The smell of rosemary mixed with whispers of fear. Further along the street, laughter echoed. The tavern keeper poured ale into wooden mugs, his smile broad but his eyes sharp. Taverns were not only for drink, they were the internet of the age, where news spread, alliances formed, and strangers met. The tavern keeper knew everything, though he rarely said a word. Beneath the laughter and music, he heard every rumor before it reached the castle. And then there were the traveling performers, jugglers, fire eaters, storytellers, who brought moments of wonder to weary hearts. The mummers acted out plays of saints and sinners, hope and folly. Their masks reflected the fears and dreams of the people. For a few coins they gave escape, and when the crowd dispersed, they vanished into the road again, leaving only footprints and memory. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the cobblestones. The smell of baking bread drifted from cottages. The baker, rising long before dawn, was still at work. His oven glowed like a small sun, its heat constant through the seasons. Bread was life itself, sacred enough to be blessed at church and broken at every table. In famine, it became currency. In feast, it was celebration. By twilight, the roads filled once more. Pilgrims sought shelter at the hospice, run by monks and nuns. The Hospitaller brothers washed wounds, served soup, and offered beds of straw. To heal the body was to heal the soul. The candlelight flickered across faces lined with exhaustion, but also with peace. Farther away, the shepherd whistled softly to his flock, his figure small against the endless hills. He lived apart, close to silence, measuring time by stars and seasons. His was one of the oldest professions, older than kings, older than faith. When storms rolled in, he drew his cloak tight, the sheep pressing close around him. Alone, yet never lonely, he belonged to the land more than to mankind. And so the medieval world moved, castle and village, merchant and monk, beggar and baron, all bound together by need, by belief, by invisible threads of duty. Every strange profession had its place, and every place its reason. To modern eyes, these lives might seem crude or cruel, but in their time, they made perfect sense. The gravedigger kept pestilence at bay. The blacksmith forged both tools in safety. The pilgrim carried stories that stitched distant lands together. Each role was a response to danger, to scarcity, to the unending mystery of existence. As night fell again, the road quieted. A single lantern flickered near the crossroads. Somewhere, a peddler hummed a tune under his breath. A bell tolled from the distant chapel. The world exhaled. And in that stillness, if you listened closely, you could almost hear it, the slow, collective heartbeat of a civilization built not only on kings and conquests, but on countless hands working in the half-light, each performing some small, necessary miracle. The medieval night returned, vast and tender. Fires dimmed. Dogs curled beneath carts. Pilgrims dreamed of holy cities. And above them all, the stars burned with quiet indifference, watching as humanity, fragile, foolish, faithful, kept moving forward, one strange job at a time. If the medieval castle was the body of power and the village its beating heart, then the church was its soul, vast, silent, and eternal. Its towers reached toward heaven, yet its roots sank deep into human fear and longing. Everything, birth, sin, sickness, marriage, death, passed through its hands. The church was not merely a building of stone. It was a living organism, breathing faith and feeding on devotion. And within its quiet shadow lived men and women whose lives were shaped by strange vocations, occupations born from holiness, fear, and necessity. In the pale morning light, the monks of St. Gerald's Abbey rose before dawn. Their bells tolled softly through the mist, calling them to prayer. The air was cold, smelling of wax and damp stone. Barefoot, wrapped in woolen habits, they walked to the chapel in silence. Not a word was spoken. The only sound was the rustle of robes and the echo of Latin chants. This was their life, ordered, repetitive, and strangely peaceful. The monks prayed 7 times a day, following the rhythm of the divine office. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Between these hours, they worked, tilling fields, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, making cheese, healing the sick. Every monastery was a self-contained world, with its own gardens, workshops, and scriptoriums. The illuminators, hunched over wooden desks, painted the Word of God in gold and blue. Their quills moved like whispers across the page. Each letter was a prayer, each illustration a window into paradise. They painted angels with wings like flames, saints with solemn eyes, and intricate borders filled with vines and beasts. In the stillness of the scriptorium, time ceased to exist. Only the flicker of the oil lamps and the scratching of quills marked the passing hours. To copy scripture was to hold eternity in your hands. But not all within the church lived in such calm light. Beyond the cloisters, in the cities and along the roads, there moved another kind of servant, the friars, the wandering brothers. Unlike monks, they owned nothing, not even the walls around them. The Franciscans and Dominicans walked barefoot through mud and filth, preaching in marketplaces, tending to lepers, hearing the confessions of thieves. They were the church's voice among the poor, and yet their work was as dangerous as it was holy. The roads were full of temptation and hunger. They slept in barns, begged for bread, and faced ridicule from those they sought to save. Still, they believed poverty itself was their path to grace. In the dim interior of a village church, another figure waited, the confessor. Draped in dark robes, he listened from behind a wooden screen. His voice was soft, patient, unhurried. Sinners knelt, whispering secrets they had never spoken aloud. Theft, lust, doubt, rage. The confessor carried the weight of hundreds of souls, and his penance was silence. He could never reveal what he heard, even if it meant his own death. And yet, confession was not always free. In many parishes, a small coin was expected, a token of repentance. It was a delicate balance between salvation and commerce. The church, vast as it was, needed coin to survive, to build cathedrals, to feed its orders, to pay its scribes. Thus arose the strange trade of indulgence sellers. These men, often eloquent and charming, traveled with parchment and seal, offering time off from purgatory for those who gave alms. To modern ears it sounds corrupt, but to the medieval mind it was merciful. Time was currency, and eternity was expensive. Beside the confessor worked the exorcist, a rare and feared figure. He was called when strange cries echoed in a house, when a child spoke in unknown tongues, when cattle died without reason. Armed with holy water, relics, and Latin prayers, he battled the unseen. His faith was both weapon and armor. To fail was to lose more than life. It was to surrender a soul to darkness. At the heart of every cathedral stood the choir, rows of men and boys whose voices rose like smoke. Their music filled the vaults, turning stone into something living. Gregorian chants, measured and pure, flowed like water through candlelight. To hear it was to believe, if only for a moment, that heaven was near. Yet behind the glory of the choir stood humble laborers, the organ blower who pumped air into the pipes, the bell ringer whose call summoned the faithful, the sexton who swept the aisles and tended the graves outside. Their work was lowly but sacred. A single missed bell could disturb the rhythm of faith. The bell foundry, hidden on the outskirts of towns, was another holy workshop. Bells were not merely metal, they were baptized, named, and blessed. Each had a voice of its own. The men who cast them were both craftsmen and priests of sound. They mixed copper and tin by moonlight, reciting prayers as molten fire poured into molds. When a new bell was born, the whole village gathered to hear its first song. And then there were the hermits, who rejected even the community of monks. They lived in caves, forests, or stone cells built into church walls, called anchor-holds. They spoke to no one, eating only what others left at their door. Yet people came from miles away to ask their blessing. Silence, it seemed, had its own kind of authority. Not all holy men were saints, though. Some walked darker paths. The relic traders, for example, were part pilgrim, part conman. They traveled with wagons full of bones and glass cases, claiming to possess the finger of a saint, or a drop of Christ's blood. Crowds gathered, coins clinked, and miracles were sometimes reported. Whether real or imagined hardly mattered. Faith and fraud often wore the same robe. In some towns, the sin-eater appeared at funerals of the poor. A man or woman, usually shunned by society, would sit beside the corpse and eat bread and ale placed on the chest of the dead. It was believed that by consuming the food, they absorbed the dead person's sins, allowing the soul to pass clean into heaven. The sin-eater was paid little, feared much, and remembered never. Deep in the monasteries, the almoner distributed charity. Each day the poor lined up outside the gates, orphans, widows, beggars, lepers. The almoner's hands passed out bread, coins, and blessings. He recorded every gift, believing each act of mercy built a stairway to heaven. His duty reminded the wealthy that salvation was not found in gold, but in giving it away. The herbalist monks tended gardens that were more pharmacy than paradise. Rows of rosemary, sage, and yarrow filled the air with scent. They mixed salves, distilled potions, and brewed teas for the sick. Their knowledge of plants was unmatched, though their remedies sometimes mixed prayer with superstition. A leaf for fever, a charm for pain, a whispered psalm for the dying. In candlelit infirmaries, the nuns worked tirelessly. Their lives were a blend of tenderness and endurance. They cleaned wounds, comforted the dying, and raised orphans left at the convent gate. Their compassion built the foundation of medieval healthcare long before medicine had a name. Every abbey had its scribe and its librarian, guardians of knowledge in an age of forgetting. The librarian held the keys to wisdom, books chained to shelves so they could never be stolen. To read was to wield power. To write was to resist time. In their silence, they preserved the thoughts of worlds long gone. But for every act of piety, there was temptation. The church grew rich. Bishops lived like princes. Gold chalices gleamed while peasants starved. Some monks broke their vows, drank too deeply, or fell in love. Humanity crept even into holy walls. Yet the church endured as unshakable as stone because people needed to believe in something greater than their pain. The nights within monasteries were long. After Compline, silence fell. Only the sound of the wind and distant owls remained. Candles burned low beside the crucifix. Somewhere, a monk continued to copy by lamplight, refusing to stop before he finished a page. Outside, rain whispered against the cloister arches. The church slept, but never completely. There was always someone praying somewhere, a rhythm older than empire, deeper than fear. And so the strange professions of faith continued. The confessor listening in darkness, the monk mixing herbs, the bell ringer greeting dawn, the hermit waiting for no one. They seemed peculiar to modern eyes, but in their world, every role served a sacred balance. The church was not just a sanctuary from chaos. It was a web of human hands, trembling but devoted, weaving meaning from mystery. And beyond the abbey gates, the world turned once more, peasants sowing, kings scheming, merchants counting coins, while behind thick stone walls, unseen voices sang to the invisible. As midnight arrived, the bells tolled again. Their echo rolled across the sleeping countryside, over rivers, through forests, and into dreams. Somewhere a pilgrim stirred, whispering a prayer before sleep. Somewhere else a monk dipped his quill into ink, tracing the next word of a story that would survive them all. Faith, labor, and mystery, woven together like the threads of a tapestry lit by candlelight. The church held them all, strange and familiar, sacred and flawed. And when dawn came again, the same bells would call the world back to its knees, to begin another day of prayer, penance, and purpose, each man and woman still bound to their chosen, curious profession beneath the gaze of God. When the bells of the church ceased their echo and the last prayer of the night faded into silence, another rhythm began far beyond the monastery walls, the rhythm of steel and footsteps. The world, after all, was not built only by the pious. It was shaped by those who fought, bled, and buried the cost of kingdoms. In the vast gray dawns of the medieval age, war was not a choice. It was a condition of existence. Land was life. Power was survival. Faith was often a flag. And around those ideals revolved 1,000 strange professions, the lifeblood of every campaign and conquest. The first to stir in a camp before sunrise was often the armorer. His forge glowed faintly like a beating heart in the mist. Sparks leapt and hissed as his hammer struck steel. Each blow was both art and prayer, a rhythm of survival. He knew the weight of a man's life better than the soldier who wore his work. Every dented breastplate, every battered helm returned to him like a wounded child. He mended them silently, for he knew that no prayer could stop an arrow, but a well-fitted plate might. The air around him was filled with smoke, sweat, and the tang of hot iron. Sometimes a knight would stand beside him, silent, watching his own reflection flicker in the red metal. Armor, to the knight, was not merely protection. It was identity, a second skin forged from pride and fear. And when the armorer etched a family crest into the steel, it was more than a symbol. It was a soul's shield. Nearby, another fire burned, that of the blacksmith of war, the maker of weapons. His anvil rang out through the camp, calling men like a bell of battle. He shaped sword and spear, arrowhead and axe. In a way, he was the dark twin of the monk in the scriptorium, both shaping human destiny, one in ink, the other in iron. Each stroke of the hammer wrote another line in the history of blood. Then there were the Fletchers, the arrow makers, quiet men who worked with goose feathers and ashwood, carving slender shafts that could end a life in an instant. They spoke little. Their hands were calloused, their eyes patient. In every bundle of arrows they prepared, there lay a strange poetry, creation made for destruction. When the army began to march, another profession came alive, the standard bearer. He carried the banner, bright against the gray of morning. It was heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. Men followed it, died for it, believed in it. To drop it was shame. To hold it high amid chaos was glory. Many died with one hand still clutching their banner's pole. Around the standard gathered the men at arms, the core of the army. They were not nobles, yet not peasants either. Paid in coin or loot, they followed whoever could feed them. They fought not for cause, but for contract. Their lives were measured in battles survived, scars earned, and debts left unpaid. When they removed their armor, they looked like any other man. But under the helmet, their faces were maps of exhaustion and defiance. The knights, by contrast, lived by a code, or so the song said. In truth, they were warriors with manners, soldiers wrapped in ceremony. Their oaths to kings and God bound them tighter than any chain. A knight's life was one long contradiction: honor in killing, faith in conquest, piety in bloodshed. Before battle, they prayed beside priests, confessing sins they had yet to commit. They knew they would kill before sunset, and they prayed for forgiveness before doing it. At their side rode the squires, boys barely old enough to shave, tasked with cleaning armor, tending horses, and carrying messages through chaos. For them, every battle was a classroom. They learned courage by proximity to death. Many never lived to become knights, yet their loyalty stitched the fragile order of war together. As the army moved, the camp followers trailed. Behind, cooks, washerwomen, seamstresses, blacksmiths' apprentices, traders, thieves, and lovers. They were the invisible engine of every campaign. They cooked, mended, healed, and sometimes stole. To many, they were little more than shadows, yet without them the army would have starved. Among them worked the field surgeons, grim, efficient, and unimaginably brave. They carried knives sharper than mercy, saws that sang through bone. Their tents smelled of blood and vinegar. They fought a different kind of battle, against infection, shock, and despair. They had no anesthesia, no clean instruments, only faith in their own hands. They amputated, stitched, and prayed, often in that order. A good surgeon was valued more than gold, though he too often died young, poisoned by the air he breathed. When the fighting began, the air changed. It was no longer a place for prayer or talk. It became a storm of metal and screams. The archers loosed their volleys in silence, the strings of their bows snapping like whips. Arrows fell like rain, darkening the sky. To be an archer was to hold death at your fingertips. They were often peasants, lightly paid, but their skill could decide a kingdom's fate. A single archer could kill a knight worth 100 times his worth, and for that, many nobles despised them, yet feared them too. The drummers and trumpeters were the heartbeat of the army. They gave rhythm to chaos, order to fear. Their beats told men when to march, when to halt, when to charge. In the fog of war, sound was command. A single misplaced note could doom a flank. Their job was not glorious, but vital. Some of them were children, too young to fight, but old enough to count beats between deaths. When battle ended, the dead lay thick upon the earth, and another profession began its grim work, the grave diggers. They came after silence, moving among the bodies with shovels and linen. They knew the difference between the sleeping and the gone. They covered friend and foe alike, for death had no allegiance. The smell of decay clung to their clothes, the image of the fallen to their dreams. Yet without them, the living could not go on. Behind them came the armor scavengers, men licensed to strip battlefields of metal. They removed helmets, mail, boots, even teeth. It was a vile but necessary trade, the recycling of war. From the scraps they sold, new weapons were forged, new armor shaped. The circle of death was complete, efficient, almost ritualistic. Among the soldiers rode another figure, the herald. Half bureaucrat, half bard, he carried the emblems of noble houses, recorded casualties, and negotiated truces. He was the voice between enemies, the scribe of slaughter. His duty was to remember who had died where, so that history would not become a rumor. And when night fell, the minstrels took over, men who sang of the day's glory beside campfires. They turned blood into ballad, fear into fame. They strummed lutes with trembling hands, their songs both prayer and propaganda. In their verses, the dead rose again as heroes, and defeat was softened into legend. The next morning, those who survived listened and believed, because they had to. Beyond the battlefield, there were stranger jobs still. The executioners, for instance, were the long arm of the law and the shadow of the crown. They traveled with armies to dispense justice, hanging deserters, torturing spies, or ending the suffering of the mortally wounded. People feared them, yet their work was indispensable. Without them, order could not be maintained. Their faces were often hidden by hoods, their names erased from records, as though society needed their service but could not bear their humanity. The camp priests moved through the dead and the dying, giving last rites amid flies and blood. Their Latin prayers mingled with groans. Sometimes they buried men with broken swords still in their hands. Sometimes they wept quietly before returning to the living. To them, war was the loudest confession humanity ever made. In the corners of every battlefield lurked the scavenger women, sometimes called battle witches. They collected bones, cloth, and sometimes blood, to sell to apothecaries, smiths, or alchemists. Legend said they could tell the future by touching a corpse's eyes. In truth, they were survivors in a world that left women no place but the margins of death. At the edge of it all stood the messengers, boys on horseback who carried orders across chaos. They were invisible threads connecting command and confusion. Many never returned. Their courage was silent, their deaths unmarked. Yet without them, even the mightiest army was blind. And when the war was done, when banners were torn, fields burned, and rivers ran red, a final class of workers appeared. The rebuilders, stone masons, carpenters, peasants, summoned from ashes. They repaired bridges, patched towers, and raised walls once more. Their hands reversed what war had made, their labor a prayer to continuity. To live in that age was to live between two eternities, the one promised by priests and the one carved by swords. Every profession, no matter how dark, served a purpose. War was horror, yes, but it was also economy, invention, and order in disguise. The world learned metallurgy, medicine, logistics, and courage from its cruelty. And so the cycle turned, blacksmith to warrior, warrior to corpse, corpse to legend, legend to song. Each job, strange as it seems, was a thread in the fabric of survival. Far away, in the silence after battle, the bells of a monastery tolled again, perhaps for the dead, perhaps for the living. Their echo traveled over ruined fields and broken spears, through the camps where armor cooled beside the fire. A knight knelt by the bodies of his men. An armorer wiped his forge. A priest whispered over the graves. A minstrel tuned his lute. The world moved on, always toward the next dawn, The next war, the next reason to remember why, even in destruction, work continued. And in that strange, brutal order, there was something hauntingly human, a stubborn will to keep building, fighting, and believing, even when surrounded by the endless noise of death. When the noise of war faded and the smoke thinned into memory, another world awoke, quieter, subtler, and far more dangerous. Not the clash of steel, but the whisper of silk. Not the scream of the dying, but the turning of a lock in a darkened chamber. The medieval world did not rest between wars. It plotted, and in those plots, strange professions flourished, born from fear, greed, faith, and curiosity. The castle at night was never silent. Behind its walls, the fire in the great hall dimmed, torches guttered, and the guards dozed in corners. Yet somewhere, feet padded softly over stone. Someone listened, waited or wrote. Power, after all, was not merely won with swords. It was maintained with information. The first of these hidden workers was the spy. In a world without newspapers, without printing, without telegraph or whispering wire, spies were the arteries through which truth or poison flowed. They could be anyone, a monk carrying messages between monasteries, a washerwoman overhearing soldiers, a minstrel moving from court to court with more than songs in his head. They worked in shadows, their pay measured in silver or survival. A wrong word meant the gallows. A right one meant influence. Some spies were trained by kings. Others were merchants who sold secrets like spices, the location of a rival army, the rumor of a duke's betrayal, the shape of a queen's affection. Information was gold, but unlike gold, it could not be hoarded. It had to be traded to retain its worth. And behind every spy stood the spy master, patient, faceless, and cold. He never appeared in songs or records. He watched, compiled, and waited. His network reached through monasteries, harbors, brothels, and battlefields. If the church was the soul of the medieval world and wore its body, then the spy master was its nervous system, unseen but omnipresent, feeling every tremor of dissent. In candlelight, another kind of knowledge was being pursued, the work of the alchemists. Their chambers smelled of sulfur, ink, and desperation. By day they appeared as scholars, healers, or astrologers. By night they mixed mercury with dreams. They searched for the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance said to turn lead into gold and grant eternal life. But in truth, their experiments were not merely madness. From their failures were born the first whispers of chemistry, medicine, and physics. The alchemist's table was chaos, vials, symbols, manuscripts, and secret codes. Their furnaces glowed like small suns. Their notebooks filled with symbols, dragons, circles, and flames. To the church, they were both threat and temptation. Some were executed as heretics. Others were funded by kings. It was said that the alchemist's fire was as dangerous as any sword, for it burned not flesh, but certainty. Close cousins to the alchemists were the astrologers, readers of the heavens. Every king had one. They mapped the stars and advised when to wage war, when to wed, when to sign treaties. To modernize, they seem quaint. To medieval minds, they were as essential as priests. Their charts were fate itself. A single comet could change a crown's course. In a small, smoky chamber at the edge of a city, another profession thrived: the apothecary. Part doctor, part chemist, part magician, he sold powders for pain, tonics for love, and drafts for sleep. His shelves were filled with jars of dried roots, preserved snakes, and strange stones. He knew the balance between cure and poison better than anyone. Many worked secretly with alchemists or physicians, passing recipes that mixed medicine with mysticism. But among all professions of shadow, few were as feared or necessary as the executioners. They were the law's final hand, both hated and protected. No man shook their hand. No woman would marry them willingly. They lived at the edge of towns, marked by silence. Yet kings and bishops needed them more than they admitted. By day, they practiced their craft on straw dummies or livestock. By night, they prayed, not for forgiveness, but for precision. A clean stroke was mercy. A botched one was sin. They executed nobles with the sword, peasants with rope, and heretics with fire. Their tools were polished, wrapped in cloth, and carried like relics. And when the deed was done, they buried the condemned themselves, for no priest would do it. Yet the executioner's family often held strange privileges: the right to collect tolls, to own land no one else wanted, to act as unofficial healers. It was said that the hand that took life could also draw out disease. People came secretly at night, asking for charms, potions, or blessings. Thus, the boundary between death and healing blurred once again. In the courts of kings and queens, a lighter profession balanced the darkness: the fool. The jester's bells jingled where swords clanged. He danced, joked, and mocked even the crown itself. His motley costume was his armor, his wit his weapon. He alone could speak truth wrapped in laughter. In an age where honesty could kill, the fool survived by disguising it as folly. Some fools were truly simple-minded. Others were philosophers in disguise. They memorized secrets heard between laughter and music. They knew who plotted against whom, who loved in secret, who prayed without faith. A clever jester could outlive a dozen courtiers. Kings kept them not only for amusement, but for sanity. Then there were the storytellers, wandering bards and chroniclers. They moved between courts, carrying tales, half history and half invention. They preserved memory where ink was scarce. Their stories turned brutal wars into sagas of destiny, tyrants into heroes, and failures into lessons. Each time they spoke, the past shifted slightly, truth reshaped by rhythm. Among them walked the troubadours, poets of love and melancholy. Their songs softened hearts hardened by war. They sang beneath castle balconies, or at feasts where knights boasted and drank. Through them, emotion became currency, the promise of affection, the illusion of purity. In their verses, even brutality found beauty. Yet not all entertainers served innocence. In the cities and taverns, the mummers performed, masked actors, comedians, dancers. They played devils, saints and kings, mocking the high and mighty. Their stages were marketplaces, their payment, coins tossed from laughter. Sometimes their jokes led to prison, sometimes to fame. In their art, freedom survived, brief, dangerous, intoxicating. Behind every court, another kind of stage existed, darker, quieter, the chamber of the poisoner. A servant's hand, a lover's cup, a physician's vial, poison was the elegant weapon of the powerful. It left no trace of battle, no need for confession. Women often became skilled in it, not from malice but from survival. A queen, trapped by politics, learned to defend herself in the only way the age allowed, in secrecy. The poisoner studied the apothecary's craft, mastered patience, and vanished in history's margins. Her success was invisibility. Her art left no witnesses. And so, through invisible deaths, thrones changed hands, and dynasties rose or fell. Alongside them worked the scribes of secrecy, royal clerks who recorded forbidden treaties, coded letters, and oaths sealed in wax. They wrote in ciphers only they understood. One slip of ink could doom a nation. They were invisible authors of fate, the architects of silence. And when darkness fell over cities, another profession crept out, the night watchman. lantern in hand, staff by their side, they patrolled narrow streets, calling the hour. Past 11 and all's well. They were guardians of peace, though they saw more crime than virtue. Their eyes watched thieves, lovers and ghosts alike. They stood between order and chaos, invisible but essential. Outside the walls, in the forests and moors, another figure lingered, the hermit healer. Once monk, now exile, he treated wounds others feared. He gathered herbs by moonlight, muttered prayers half pagan, half Christian. People came secretly, offering bread or candles for cures. His hut smelled of moss and secrets. The church called him dangerous. The poor called him saint. And then, there were the gravediggers of plague years, when death no longer came one by one, but by hundreds. They worked without rest, their faces wrapped in cloth soaked with vinegar. No priest would follow them. No family dared approach. They dug until their hands bled, until their own bodies fell into the pits they made. Yet without them, the living would drown beneath the weight of the dead. They were nameless heroes in an age of despair. In the same years, physicians and plague doctors emerged, wearing bird-beaked masks filled with herbs, their canes pointing to the sick from a distance. They walked streets no one else dared. To many, they looked like death itself. To others, salvation. Their strange outfits were both superstition and science, the first attempt to fight an invisible enemy with knowledge, however imperfect. Within this twilight world of spies, alchemists, jesters, and healers, the boundaries between good and evil blurred. Every act of deceit had its purpose, every experiment its price. The medieval world was not divided between light and dark. It was a tapestry of both, woven tightly together. And as kings plotted and peasants prayed, these hidden workers moved silently beneath them, guiding history from the shadows. Their tools were ink, poison, music, or fear. Their craft, survival. Sometimes they met in taverns, exchanging news in riddles. Sometimes they died unknown, their secrets buried deeper than any treasure. But without them, kingdoms would have crumbled faster, wars would have lasted longer, and faith might have lost its mystery. In the end, when candles burned low and only the scribe's quill or the fool's laughter remained, one truth lingered. Every world, even one built on faith and blood, needs its shadows to survive. For in the dark, the unseen hands worked, steady, clever, and often kind. The alchemist searching for light in matter, the spy listening for truth in lies, the jester turning pain into laughter, the healer mixing mercy into medicine. They were the pulse, beneath the silence of crowns, the breath between wars, the secret life of the Middle Ages. And as dawn crept, over the rooftops of stone cities, the first bells rang again, not for prayer, but for awakening. The shadows vanished back into daylight, leaving behind only whispers, symbols, and the faint smell of smoke and ink. When dawn broke over the stone walls of medieval cities, the sound that filled the air was not the hymn of monks nor the horn of soldiers. It was commerce. The marketplace was the true heart of the Middle Ages, pulsing, chaotic, alive. It was where peasants met merchants, pilgrims met thieves, monks met sinners. It was the only place where rank briefly dissolved, where gold and hunger spoke a common language. Stalls unfolded like petals at sunrise. Canvas roofs stretched over wooden tables. Women carried baskets of onions and saltfish. Men dragged carts of hides, barrels, or wheat. Children darted through crowds, chasing dogs or stealing fruit. The smell was thick: sweat, bread, dung, roasted meat, and spilled ale, the perfume of survival. Every market had its rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer sang from the edge of the square, where sparks leapt like fireflies. The butcher's block echoed with dull thuds. The tanner's vats smoked foully near the riverbank, where hides soaked in lime and filth, and between them, the hawkers shouted, each with a song, a story, or a lie. Best apples this side of the King's Road. Fresh bread from St. Mark's ovens. Charms to keep away fever, blessed by a monk, cheap as sin. No cathedral sermon ever reached as many ears as the chorus of the market. It was where people learned the price of life each morning. Among the crowd walked the merchants, men and women who lived on risk. Their wealth lay not in what they owned, but in what they could move. From Flanders to Florence, from Damascus to York, they carried silk, pepper, glass, and rumor. They were the arteries between worlds, and their caravans stitched the continents together. Some grew rich enough to challenge lords. Others lost everything to storms, pirates, or dishonest partners. They dealt in trust and calculation, weighing not only goods, but danger. They bribed guards, hired mercenaries, and paid tolls at every border. Their ledgers were as sacred as scripture. The medieval merchant's life was part adventure, part arithmetic, part prayer. Every journey was a gamble, of profit, of life. Beside them moved another kind of trader, the moneylender. In an age where coins were rare and kings perpetually in debt, these men wielded silent power. They lent gold to nobles for wars, to merchants for voyages, to peasants for seed. The church condemned usury, yet every bishop borrowed. It was sin turned necessity. Many moneylenders were foreigners, especially Jews, forbidden from owning land, but vital to the economy. They lived under protection and threat, needed and hated in equal measure. Their accounts were written in codes, their doors barred with iron. When debts could not be paid, violence often followed. In dark alleys, coins changed hands beneath cloaks. Sometimes, so did lives. Not all trades dealt in silver, some dealt in service. The cobblers, weavers and potters shaped the texture of daily life. Each craft had its guild, its code, its patron saint. Guild banners hung like holy icons, scissors for tailors, hammer for smiths, ship for sailors. To belong was protection and discipline. An apprentice worked from dawn to dusk, learning not just the craft, but the silence of obedience. Journeymen traveled town to town, carrying tools like holy relics, and masters ruled workshops like tiny kingdoms. Their world was measured in strokes of a blade, turns of a wheel, and the weight of a finished piece. They built more than goods. They built identity. Beyond the guilds, the street trades thrived, those without charter or shield. The fishwives, loud and fearless, ruled the morning, the eye. Water carriers trudged through mud with barrels on their backs. The rag pickers scoured gutters for scraps of cloth or bone. The night soil men collected human waste for farmers outside the walls. Their work was filth, but it kept the city alive. Every coin they earned was heavy with exhaustion. Yet among them grew a fierce solidarity, the brotherhood of survival. The city was their master, their monster, their home. At the edge of the square, a different trade blossomed, the tavern. By day, it was a place for meals. By night, a theater of confession. Merchants drank beside soldiers, thieves beside priests. Deals were struck, songs sung, fights started. It was said that in the tavern's dim corners, history took shape, not in courts, but in whispers over ale. Tavern keepers were part host, part spy, part peacekeeper. They knew everyone's secrets and priced them accordingly. A spilled cup of wine could mean a ruined life. They were the city's unofficial chroniclers, their ledgers written in gossip. And where there were taverns, there were beggars. The beggars of medieval towns were not merely poor. They were a caste, an economy. Each had a territory, a method, a story. Some faked wounds, others displayed real ones. Some sang hymns, others cursed. The blind, the lame, the orphaned, each had a role to play in the theater of pity. Pilgrims often gave alms, believing it bought salvation. But the beggars understood better than priests the true currency of faith, guilt. They read faces like books, knowing whom to follow, whom to avoid. The cleverest among them formed groups, ruled by a beggar king who distributed corners and shares. To survive, they learned tongues, gestures, lies. The city's pity was their market, their souls, their trade. Yet not all who begged were cheats. Some were victims of the land, peasants driven from fields by war, plague, or tax. They wandered from village to village, carrying only hunger. To them, begging was not a choice, but a season, another harvest that never came. And above them, the lords and their manors grew fat on rents and tithes. Between these worlds stood the market priest, blessing bread, weighing sin against coin. He heard confessions between stalls, sold indulgences, and sometimes stole glances at the tavern girls. Even holiness had its price. Out in the fields, far from the city's roar, the peasants continued their eternal rhythm. They sowed, reaped, and died without name. Their tools were crude, their backs bent, their prayers constant. Theirs was a life measured by weather and whim. A good harvest meant life. A storm meant famine. Their children knew the soil before they knew letters. They paid rent in grain, tax in labor, and tithe in faith. 3 masters, none merciful. But sometimes rebellion smoldered. When the lords raised taxes or took too much, the peasants gathered, torches in hand, eyes like storms. They burned barns, broke chains, and for a brief moment, the earth trembled beneath their rage. Yet the next year, the fields were plowed again. History moved on, indifferent. In every medieval town, there existed another invisible network: the street healers, the fortune tellers, the charm sellers. They worked where the church's blessings failed. They sold luck, love, fertility, or forgiveness in amulets and powders. Women often led these trades, part witch, part doctor, part psychologist. Their words soothed more than their herbs healed. They lived under threat of accusation, yet they endured, for fear itself was good business. And in the same streets, laughter never died. The jugglers, musicians, and street actors performed for bread. Their songs carried rumors faster than letters. Sometimes kings forbade them. Sometimes they were invited to palaces. A good tune could travel farther than an army. A sharp verse could start a riot. The crowd was their audience and their judge. Every coin thrown was applause. Every silence, starvation. By nightfall, when the bells rang curfew and torches lit the corners, the market transformed. The merchants closed their stalls, but the thieves' guilds opened theirs. In the same alleys where bread had been sold, daggers now glittered. The trade of the night was quieter. Stolen cloth, pilfered silver, forbidden books, and flesh. Prostitutes appeared at doorways, painted and weary. They too were workers of a kind, taxed by the city, protected by guards, condemned by priests. Their trade was older than law, as constant as hunger. They offered not just desire, but escape from loneliness, from fear, from the rigid order of daylight. Some ran their own houses, ruled with sharp minds and sharper tongues. Others were enslaved, trapped by debt or deceit. Behind every closed shutter, 1,000 private tragedies played out in whispers. In the morning, it would all begin again. The carts would roll in, the stalls unfold, the hammers ring. Coins would change hands. Prayers would rise, the poor would bow. The city would hum, pulse, and devour. The market was a mirror of the age, where greed and generosity walked hand in hand, where survival was an art and dignity a daily invention. Above it all, the castle stood, its windows catching the sunlight, watching, aloof, unknowing, dependent. For without the clamor below, the silence above could not exist. The sun rose slowly over the medieval world, as it had for centuries. Stone castles cast long shadows over cities that had seen generations born and die under their walls. Yet the air was different now. It trembled with whispers of change, a new rhythm, a new possibility. The world that had been held together by faith, fear, and labor was beginning to breathe in a new way. The abbeys were quieter than usual. Monks still chanted, but their songs carried an edge of uncertainty. The illuminator's quills hovered above parchment, unsure of whether to record the known or imagine the unknown. The old maps, the manuscripts, the relics, all seemed suddenly fragile, as if the weight of knowledge was beginning to tip the world. In one small scriptorium, a young monk paused mid-letter. He held the quill over vellum, looking at the stars outside the window. He had heard whispers of a new invention, letters that could be multiplied, paper that could be pressed, knowledge that could escape the walls of the monastery. He realized that the future might not need him in the same way. Yet in his chest, a rhythm of pride and fear coexisted. Beyond the abbey walls, the streets of the city moved with their usual clamor. Merchants unpacked cloth dyed in deeper colors, spices arriving from distant lands, haggling and shouting filled the square. But now there was something else, a different pulse, printed sheets, handbills, news of faraway events. Knowledge was beginning to flow faster than gold or coin. The old trades remained, the blacksmiths, cobblers, weavers, but a subtle change was evident. Innovation crept in with small steps. A new wheel design, a different forge technique, a lighter loom. The medieval artisan was learning to bend not just metal or cloth, but time itself. In the same streets, beggars, prostitutes, and performers adjusted to a changing world. The fools still mocked, the jugglers still danced, but now they faced an audience that could read, write, and remember. Their stories would live beyond their voices. The invisible threads that once carried gossip and rumor now had carriers in printed letters and pamphlets. In the castles, kings and nobles felt the tremor. Wars were no longer just fought with swords. Diplomacy, letters, and treaties carried stakes just as high. The standard-bearers, once essential, now found themselves symbols rather than instruments of strategy. Mercenaries still marched, but the maps they followed were drawn by cartographers who could record, multiply, and share knowledge across borders. The church, once the unshakable spine of society, felt the stirrings of change. Some abbeys were still centers of learning. Some bishops still commanded fear. Yet whispers of reform, of debate, and of science slipped through the gates. The alchemists and astrologers saw new tools for observation. The skeptics grew bolder. Faith remained, but it now had to coexist with inquiry. In the dark alleys, the spies, thieves, and secret keepers noticed the subtle shift. Information, once carried by human legs alone, could now travel by ink and press. The spy's skill was still precious, but letters and printed words made him one of many. Poisoners, too, found that their subtle arts could be traced more easily, their secrets exposed by record-keeping and observation. Yet even as change pressed upon them, the medieval world clung to its rhythms. The armorer still hammered, the apothecary still brewed, the executioner still readied his tools. The pulse of labor, survival, and fear remained constant, a heartbeat against the tide of innovation. The streets still smelled of bread, sweat, and wood smoke. The market still rang with haggling and shouting. The beggars still pleaded, and children still darted through the crowd. Life, in its messy, chaotic reality, persisted. And then came the first sparks of Renaissance thought. In the libraries, in private studies, in the courts, artists began to measure perspective. Inventors sketched machines that could fly or lift. Physicians studied anatomy with fresh eyes. The world's old fears began to coexist with curiosity. In a small room high in a tower, a scholar held a compass over a globe. He realized that the world was larger than anyone had ever imagined. Trade routes stretched farther. Knowledge traveled faster, and ideas no longer depended on a single voice. The monk with his quill, the merchant with his ledger, the spy with his secret, all began to see their work reflected in a wider tapestry. Even the fools, jesters, and minstrels sensed it. Their songs would no longer die at the city gate. They could be written, preserved, and studied. Their laughter would echo beyond the immediate audience, shaping thought and culture in ways no one yet understood. Meanwhile, the fields still demanded sowing and harvesting. Peasants bent beneath the weight of seasons and taxes. Yet subtly, new techniques spread. Windmills and watermills multiplied grain. Irrigation and crop rotation improved yields. The eternal struggle between humans and nature became, for the first time, winnable in part. In the courts of kings, new voices appeared. Advisors who read more than scrolls, diplomats who weighed not just gold, but alliances, art, and learning. The nobles felt the pressure of history pressing against tradition. Change was coming, inexorable, like the tide. But even as knowledge and invention expanded, the lessons of the past endured. The armorer remembered that protection saved lives. The physician remembered that death was ever near. The spy understood that secrets still mattered. The merchant knew that greed and trust were eternal companions. The fool reminded everyone that power alone could not secure hearts. And so the medieval world did not vanish. It evolved. It carried forward its strange professions, its human resilience, its mixture of fear and faith. Every monk who prayed, every soldier who fought, every merchant who bargained, all were part of a continuum. The world was expanding, but the old rhythms left their echo. In the streets, children ran with wooden swords. In the markets, coins clinked on wooden stalls. In the castles, banners flapped in the wind. And somewhere, a scholar wrote by candlelight, imagining a world in which knowledge could be shared freely, where printing presses might carry words across lands and seas. The church still rang its bells, but their toll now marked both devotion and the passage of time, a signal that the old age was learning to share its space with the new. On battlefields, swords and armor still gleamed in the sun, yet armies began to use strategy as much as strength. Spies and messengers still carried vital information, but the written word now carried weight alongside whispers. The streets of towns and cities remained crowded, chaotic, vibrant. People still struggled, survived, and thrived. Yet a glimmer of something new threaded through their labor, the promise that effort could extend beyond one lifetime, that ideas could outlive bodies. And at last, all the threads of this world, the church, the battlefield, the market, the hidden trades, the artisans, the beggars, the fools, wove together into a single story, not one of endings, but of transformation. The medieval age did not end in silence. It shifted into light, carrying memory and tradition into a new dawn. The bells tolled one final time, echoing across stone walls, rivers, and hills. It was a signal not of closure, but of continuity. Faith, labor, survival, knowledge, mischief, all persisted, transformed, and evolved. The world remembered the monks and the armorer, the merchant and the spy, the fool and the healer. it carried them into the Renaissance, into history, into imagination. The medieval age had ended, not with fire, not with collapse, but with awakening. A world forged by fear, faith, labor, and love now passed its lessons to a broader horizon. And as dawn lighted the rooftops, streets, and fields, one could hear, if one listened closely, the heartbeat of the past still strong beneath the steps of the future.